Hello and welcome to the Progress Theory, where we discuss scientific principles for optimizing human performance. I am Dr. Phil Price, and on today's episode, we're joined by S&C coach and the host of Upside Strength, Seale. Now, I've wanted to bring Sean back on the podcast for a while because I want to discuss his work with aerobic conditioning. Now, with this season of the Progress Theory, I want to know a little bit more around what's separating the very, very elite to the rest of the athletes. And could having unlimited aerobic capacity actually limit your ability to recover and also to train with high amounts of volume? I'm also going to be discussing with Sean his work on respiratory training, because many athletes actually might be respiratory limited. Well, what does that look like and how can we change training accordingly? As always, follow the Progress Theory on Instagram, YouTube, subscribe, and check out all of our other content. Here is Seale. Sean, welcome back.
Thanks, Phil. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. Thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast. Obviously, after the last one, I wanted to get round two. And when we started looking at guests for the new series, you were like first on the list. So thank you for saying yes. I've still got many questions to ask. And it looks like from your Instagram, from your social media, obviously I follow a lot of what you do on YouTube. Things have really developed since we last spoke. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about what's been going on.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. Honestly, I always like those opportunities, and the last podcast we did together was great. You asked some really good questions, and we were able to go into some interesting details. So I'm excited to do that again today. For the little update since we last spoke, like I was telling you off air just before, I have throttled down a little bit in terms of my daily activities. I was pushing too much everywhere before, which was I still had a lot of private coaching or personal training multiple days a week. And then in parallel to this, I was doing all the online stuff. I was starting to give seminars on the weekend, doing all the testing with different athletes. And that just became too much. So by November, I had it would be lying if I said I had the wherewithal. It was my wife, Lynn, who's an integral part of my success and everything that is going on. And she really helps me prioritize. And prioritizing also means, like I was saying before, saying no. So I've learned to say no to a few different things. I've offloaded my private clients to Loic and to some other coaches that I work with. And that has given me space and time to focus on all the other activities that I'm developing, mainly the in-person seminars, the testing, and all the digital courses, programs, and content that I produce as well. So I'm in a pretty good spot right now, I would say, in terms of balance. I have weeks at a time where I'm usually at home, so I work from home. We actually just recently moved my office. That's why there's nothing behind me yet, but there's going to be some painting, some drawings, and some plants at some point once we can fill up the space a little bit more. So more time at home, and then I have those periods where I go away to give a seminar, to do some testing. So trying to find, a balance in that new life, I would say. And then another upgrade that's going to come next month is Lynn, my wife, is going to come on board and actually help me with the business and with all the back end, the marketing, the emails and everything. So that's going to be a huge help, because so far I'm managing everything on my own, which is a lot and it's too much. So like I said, I prioritize, but that also means that I'm not getting as much done as I would like, which again is okay. I'm learning to be patient, but if I can do more with a couple people on board, then it might be some good fun and also free up some more time for me to do the things that I love doing, which are creating content. The more I move forward, the more I enjoy the process of creating videos, creating presentations. I really love that aspect of my job. So I'm excited in the coming months to do more of it. And I know that I haven't been making as much English content as I might have promised a few months ago. And that's another goal of mine in the coming months is to, I haven't decided yet if I'm going to duplicate my channel and have one in French, one in English. It might be a good idea for the algorithm. But either way, I plan on pushing some more English content in the coming months. So that's kind of where I am at this point.
Cool. Yeah, it was definitely great to hear from me because unfortunately I don't speak French, and I do keep a lookout for your videos and think, oh, that looks really interesting. And I kind of vaguely know what you're talking about based on the title in French, but I know I wouldn't be able to understand it. So for me, I'm being selfish here, but yeah, more content in English would be absolutely great. And I've definitely noticed a difference. I wouldn't say a difference, but some of the presentations that you've been putting out on your YouTube channel have been exceptional. Like the one you did on aerobic conditioning and the one you did on lactate. Both of them I thought were so well summarized and clearly summarized. It's I thought it was just absolutely brilliant. So you can really tell not only that now you probably, said no to a few things and it's freed you up a little bit, but also just the passion that goes into those particular projects. It's great to see, and it's amazing that it's a free resource for anyone to go and see. So,
thanks, man. I appreciate it. It's one of my favorite things to do is actually building presentations and animating them, and like you said, trying to synthesize the information and condense it into something that's manageable for most people. I would say it's probably my favorite exercise in terms of learning for myself as well, because as the adage goes, if you can explain something, you've understood it. So if I can explain something in simple terms, I can assume that I have a good grasp on it. So and that was going on a little bit of a tangent, but that was always the main idea behind creating content and all my thoughts of the day, where I just talk to my phone and say what I think on a topic for 5 to 10 minutes. And I try to do that every day. The exercise of summarizing the information that is between your two ears is, I think, the best way to learn. And if you do it every day, then you get better at it. And so that's what I try to do.
Yeah, definitely helps, one, synthesize ideas, but also for me, it helps me realize where my knowledge is lacking. So it just develops more questions for me to go and research a little bit further, because I'm always a bit cautious of if I put something out, like I would hate to think like a few months later, so actually, I don't actually agree with what I've written. I did a newsletter once and I took it down because I was like, I'm not sure I'm completely right there. But at least it led me to, I guess, develop myself a little bit better in this particular area. But if I hadn't put the stuff out there, if I hadn't created that content, I wouldn't have realized that my knowledge was deficient there. So
I would even argue that this is when you should put it out, is when you're not sure. And if you think you have something wrong, because then you get the feedback, and then people will tell you, oh, you're lacking here or you're lacking there. For example, I made it reminds me of a thought of the day I made a few weeks ago about HRV. And I have a basic understanding of how HRV works in terms of the measurement itself and how to use it to auto-regulate or to inform training that day on a day-to-day basis. But I haven't gone down the rabbit hole as far as some people have. And so I put something out pretty broad in general on one of those little clips, and somebody answered my video by email and sent me a really long email on all the details of HRV and the upsides and downsides of different measurement techniques, whether it's sitting down, standing up, using both, time constraints, material, equipment. And I was like, well, I didn't know all that. This is amazing. And so I just told the guy, you know what? Why don't you make that into a blog? And we just post it on my website, because I can't know everything, and I'll never will. And actually putting your understanding out there, it's not even the truth. It's just what you understand at that moment in time, allows you to get feedback from the world and from other people that are interested in those topics. And I find that almost more interesting or as interesting as the process of formulating the thoughts itself, because now you get multiple perspectives. Now you get some pushback, and you need friction to make diamonds. You need that pushback to try to make the ideas better. And so when I'm not sure of something, that's actually when I try to force myself to put it out, because I know I'll probably get something wrong, and that's where I can learn something. If I only talk about things I'm absolutely sure about, then the room for growth is not going to be as big.
It's really nice that he sent that information by email. And while there's nothing wrong with commenting on someone's video, and it can help the discussion that way, if you had so much information and doing it privately, I don't know, it just feels a bit like, have you considered this? And it develops more of a collaborative relationship there, rather than I'm going to write all this thing where I think this person's wrong, and hopefully I will score points if anyone else reads my comment because I'm pointing out any errors. Or, for example, sometimes social media can be a bit like that, people fighting to gain a bit more of attention, and they can feel that being critical is always being overly negatively critical of people's content or whatever they might be doing. So yeah, did they post it as a blog and it's available to read?
Not yet. We're in the process. Like I said, like I was saying before, I'm learning to say no to a lot of things. And so in the process of working on a big project right now, I've put aside, there's a laundry list of emails that are not urgent and that will be dealt with in due time, but not right now. So this is one of the emails. And to go back to your point about, constructive feedback, I think it really, the quality of the feedback and the comments that you get has to be, at least it is in my universe, it has to be linked to the way that you put out your information in the first place. If you put out your information in a very combative, absolute, contrarian almost way, you'll probably get pushback in that sense as well. But I've always been careful to, always preface something with, this is my current understanding, or this is what I think is correct, or this is what I understand of the topic, but I might be wrong, it might change. And having that tone of conversation actually invites comments the other way that are positive as well, because you're not, that's just how I function. I don't like to go against something else. And sometimes I'll have rants, rarely, but I'll have a few here and there, a few a year. I allow myself to go there. A few things piss me off, but they're few and far between. The rest of the time, I'm really just, sharing what I think I understand. And I'm also fine with the idea that there's different perspectives and maybe there's multiple good answers. It's not or, it's and. So, and that's how people are going to grow. I don't want people to listen to my material and say, oh, I'm only listening to him because he's got things figured out. I want them to go and listen to the opposing view and then 5 in between, because that's how you're going to grow in terms of the richness of those perspectives and seeing things from different angles, from different people with different backgrounds, with different informations and where they got it from. So I really think that how you communicate is going to influence the quality of the feedback that you get. Yeah,
definitely. Absolutely. And it really highlights I think it's a heuristic by Kahneman, where they talk about all you see is all there is. So yeah, people just watch one video and then would either copy and paste or believe that is absolute truth, rather than search out, the opposing view and the 5 in between, and then coming up to their own decision. I guess just watching one video and assuming that is all there is the quicker, easier route, which I don't think is the best route. So,
and that's the thing, is if you want to go deeper and if you want to look at multiple perspectives, it means trying to hold different, or sometimes often opposing views at the same time, which is, mentally taxing. And because you have that when you only listen to one version of anything, like you said, it's easier because you're only watching one thing. 2, it feels more stable. There's less unknown because there's the one perspective and that's it. When you start looking at 2 or more perspectives that aren't all going in the same direction, you start to have to, like I said, handle those opposing views and deal with the uncertainty of not knowing which one might be right, or the gray space in between. And I think that is also a mental load that you have to be ready to assume. And I guess in today's world, it's quite common to, overwork, under-recover, stress, all those things. And if you're already in a stressful place, taking the time to hold those opposing views and deal with the uncertainty that comes with them is actually work. And so I understand why not everybody does it. But obviously I do think that it's a worthwhile endeavor if you want to have a better understanding of any given topic or something that you're looking into.
shows the importance of saying no, because you need that time to and that space to have that mental clarity to deal with all of those opposing views.
Exactly.
Whenever I feel most agitated, I think is when I'm so busy, but it's also so busy that's not allowed me to do some of the work which I feel is a bit more creative and requires a little bit more thinking from myself. So I can't get those ideas out. And then if they don't, they sort of sit there, and then they're there with all of the other sort of like admin-y stuff that's kind of been a bit more overwhelming. And that's when you start to feel like, oh, I can't really take it. Which again shows the importance of saying no. It's a superpower, which we said.
It is, and I definitely think the more I wouldn't say I'm a very creative person to begin with, but from the little practice that I've had on that side of things, creativity emerges from space and time that you allow yourself to have. Like you said, you can't work really hard to be creative. You have to allow yourself the space to become creative, and it's almost like creativity is that emergent thing that comes out of having enough space and time to let you just come up with those things, or those things to come up within you, whichever way you want to frame it. And going for walks with my wife, every time we go for a drive, or we go out away for a weekend, this is when we kind of give ourselves the space to think about, okay, what's happening in the next 6 months, what's happening in the next 5 years. And those are always really great times, because we know we have time ahead of us, and we can just let ourselves think freely and explore different ideas. But like you said, if you don't allow yourself to have that time, like Alex Hormozy says, saying no to things is actually saying yes to more important things. So you have to reframe it. If you're having a hard time saying no, is by saying no to this, you're saying yes to that. And if the that is more important than the this, then you're going in the right direction.
Actually, funny, when you were describing that, I was thinking of Alex Hormozy before you even mentioned Alex Hormozy, because I saw it was actually on Threads, the new thing through Instagram, that Alex Hormozy was talking about the importance of volume when it comes to sort of marketing, and how he is creating so much content, and that's a really important factor when it comes to marketing. And then, but to create that volume of work for a lot of people would take up a lot of mental space, and you end up just creating a lot of stuff, but it wouldn't necessarily be a lot of great creative stuff. And I feel that marketing is very different from science. You need that step back. You need that time to think and things through and be creative, where with marketing, you could probably go a bit more down the volume route to, I don't want to say you want to create stuff to bludgeon people with it, because you're just constantly in their face, but there's an element of that. But when people try and apply that sort of marketing tactic to other areas of their life, I think that's when they start to really struggle. Like, science and marketing are two different domains, and we shouldn't really get them crossed over.
No, I would agree. I think there's different tools for different purposes, and the volume there's a good parallel with training as well, in the sense that if you can produce a high volume of work, whether it's in marketing or in training, that's usually gonna, as long as you can assimilate the training, and as long as you have the capacity to produce that amount of marketing content or content period. And also as long, because the other side of the equation when we talk about marketing is going to be, how good is your product, how good is your service, how good is your course. So if you have a really good course, product, or program, then the next step is to get as many people as you can to know that you're doing that. And content is one of those things. It was one of the reasons that I started my podcast, 3.5 years ago now. And one of the reasons I produce so much content, and I'm still limited in my capacities simply because of time. And this is one of the things that Lynn's going to help me with a lot. I produce anywhere from, I would say 2 to 10 hours of content, usually middle to long form content a week, depending on how many podcasts I record, how many videos I make. And all of this can be chopped up into clips and put onto YouTube and put onto Instagram. And I've seen the numbers doing it myself, and I just haven't done it consistently because of time. But I know that if I post, 2 clips a day on Instagram and on YouTube, it doubles my growth rate just because of exposure and how many people are going to see my stuff. And from the short stuff, they go to the long stuff, then they get interested in the rest, and things grow. So yeah, the volume is a huge factor, and obviously it's you have to have the bandwidth to put it out.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that tangent. That's not exactly where I thought this podcast would go originally, but
we can go anywhere, mate.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I like about this. We can just go any direction. Cool. Just to segue it back a little bit to where I wanted to pick your brain a little bit more. If we could do a little bit of a recap around, I guess we're still talking about your podcast and Upside Strength, a little bit more about why you started doing a lot of research around aerobic conditioning, because you were really finding there was a limitation with the athletes that you were working with, and it's led to great podcasts, it's led to great lectures, and it's led to courses. So where was the original gap, and why did you decide to really sort of delve straight into sort of aerobic conditioning?
The gap opened up for me when I went to watch Evan Picon's material, and I remember it was during the pandemic. I think it was the first lockdown, and I injured my back a few years ago, and that time wasn't the best of times. So I remember spending a couple of weeks lying on the couch because I literally couldn't do anything else. And I just went through the classroom, which was the Training Think Tank's educational material. And Evan's courses were in there, and that just blew my mind simply because I thought I understood conditioning, and I thought I understood some of the bioenergetics behind it. And it turned out that it seemed like I didn't understand a thing, or at least I had it all upside down when I looked at Evan's content. And because prior to that, I'd read, Joel Jamieson's Ultimate MMA Conditioning, which could be called Ultimate Sport Conditioning. And I thought I had a good grasp on that aspect of things. I worked in rugby and strength and conditioning, and the guys were doing really well. But again, that underlying the theoretical part of conditioning, I thought I had a grasp on. And upon finding Evan's content, I realized again that the gap opened up for me. And I dove in and I said, okay. And actually, from memory, I think I started seeing his stuff about a year prior, maybe a year and a half before that. And I remember saying to myself, because I read maybe a couple posts and I saw that it wasn't in line with what I thought I understood. And I remember putting that aside and saying, I'm not ready to question everything that I know about this topic right this second. So I'm just going to push it to another date in the future. Which I eventually came to, and that's when I started diving into this topic and just became completely fascinated with exercise physiology. And from there, I just kept digging and went left and right and tried to find experts, had them on the podcasts, and tried to, I guess, just rebuild my understanding of this topic from the bottom up. And even though I know for some coaches and most athletes, the underlying technical stuff isn't important at all. You don't need to understand this stuff to be good at coaching or to be good at being an athlete, especially. And there's enough gold medals and world records that have been set with a time, with a watch and nothing else, that you don't need all that theoretical understanding. But it was something that I really enjoyed, trying to figure out the why, trying to figure out the how, which I did. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to do that continuously for the past 2.5, 3 years. And I'm still not done. I still have a lot to learn and a lot to understand, but that was kind of the beginnings of this process.
I love Evan's work. I spoke to Evan last week. We've got him on the podcast again. But yeah, he's just literally a fountain of knowledge. And it's great to hear his writing process as well and how he synthesizes his thoughts. Not long after our last podcast, we talked a lot about zone 2 training.
Yeah.
Zone 2 popularity just seemed to explode on social media. I mean, I'm not saying like our episode was the exact epicenter of where that explosion happened, but I think we definitely happened before it. And the stuff that you were putting out and all your information, all your lectures, definitely increased this awareness of Zone 2 training. And I think people started to realize that, I don't really understand. They've heard of 80-20 running. They've heard of the saying of, to run fast, you need to run slow, and you put in that slow work to provide that base for your faster work. But I don't think they understood the physiology behind it. So that was really, really cool to see. And even on my Instagram, one of my most popular posts is a clip from our episode where you're explaining the importance of Zone 2 training. Just to provide a little bit of context, and then we can go into a little bit more detail. What is Zone 2 training? And I guess we don't have to lean into it that much, but I really loved your presentation where you looked at people's different definitions of where Zone 2 is. You had the one discussing Alan Cousins' definition versus Ingo Samalan's definition. And when you see it in relation to the lactate curve, they seem like very different places, and they obviously might have quite different repercussions in terms of physiological adaptation. So based on what you know now, what do you think is Zone 2 training, or how do you particularly use it, and why is that beneficial for athletes?
I think the way that it's used by most people, and the term itself, Zone 2, refers to low intensity training, period. I think that's the simplest way of bringing that forward. The difficulty with the zone conversation is that there's heart rate zones, there's power zones, there's zones based on percentages, there's zones based on physiology, and there's many ways to get to those. And I do think there's some that are better than others. And again, depending on which expert you listen to, they'll give you different definitions. And it's between this value and this value. Absolute lactate values, for example, which you hear Inigo talk about, or it's a range above and below the first inflection point of lactate. Alan's version. I tend to put Zone 2 below the first lactate threshold. The main reason behind this is that, and it really depends what population you work with as well, right? If you're working with pro cyclists, it's a completely different conversation in terms of where you should train most of the time versus somebody who's completely new to this type of training. But in general, when I define it for the people I work with, it's going to be, usually 2 to 3 out of 10 on the RPE scale. And that might seem very low, and it is, and it's intentional that way. And I guess maybe I'm maybe pulling it back a little bit more than I could or I should, intentionally, because most people just train too hard all the time. And even those that think that they're doing low intensity work, they're actually not doing low intensity work. And so to kind of recalibrate everybody's perspective on what it is, I'll usually say 2 to 3 out of 10 most of the time. And you talked about the 80-20 principle, which usually says that 80% of your volume is going to be at low intensity, 20 is going to be at the higher intensities, whether that's between threshold, above threshold 2, so kind of heavy domain or severe domain. I think you can apply the same idea to low intensity itself. So you can apply an 80-20 to your low intensity, where 80% of the low intensity volume, or maybe 80% of sessions that are targeting low intensity are comfortably below the first threshold. So again, 2 to 3 out of 10. And then once in a while, you go on that transition, on that first threshold or just above, and you're going to get a 4 or 5 out of 10. But most of the time it should be below that. And that's why, Alan talks about Zone 2 in his definition, but then he says that you should spend most of your time training in Zone 1. This should be the bulk of your training. So for him, that Zone 2 is kind of that transition. So that kind of 4 or 5 out of 10 on the RPE scale, but you should then train in Zone 1. So yeah, it depends who you listen to, but I think the main message that people need to get across is that most of your training volume should be done at really easy paces, simply because it's not going to cost you as much as being even a little bit higher than that. A 2 out of 10 and a 4 out of 10 might not look very different on paper, but in terms of the fatigue that is generated and directly linked to that, the volume that you can accumulate in a given week, in a given training period, is not going to be the same at all. So I'd rather people be a little bit lower and be able to accumulate that volume without accumulating fatigue virtually, versus being just on the cusp of, but then probably being a little bit too high most of the time, and then also kind of leaving a little bit too much energy on the table in those sessions, meaning you'll have less energy for your really pivotal high intensity sessions. So this is how I've come to define it in that way. But again, many different ways to define the same concept. And there, going back to our first topic on the podcast, I would say they're probably all right, as long as you have the context of who's putting them forward, which population they're working with, and how they would organize training around those.
Why do you think this type of training has suddenly got very popular in the CrossFit community? Is it an element of they feel that they're very deficient in the physiological adaptations that this low intensity training provides, and then all of a sudden this is kind of created a bit of a shift towards how people view their training as a whole, because they all of a sudden need to include this low intensity training because they feel deficient. And so clearly they feel this low intensity stuff is providing the base to help with the high intensity stuff, which makes sense if you if you assume that from, its application in terms of other sport like running. So why in particular CrossFit?
I think it's a cultural shift that had been coming, and that I think there's multiple facets to it. One of them being that CrossFit from the beginning was a high intensity endeavor, and that was well described by Greg Glassman in the initial papers and the description of the philosophy of CrossFit. And that was to maximize gains and minimize time invested. And that's fair enough, especially for beginners, because beginners are going to be able to progress fast when they apply that high intensity stimulus. So it makes sense that you would start with that, right? Because you're going to have fast adaptations. You're going to get buy-in as well, because you get all the hormonal stuff that comes with training when you haven't trained before. And that's going to be a positive boost. It's probably going to be more fun for someone to come back to the gym and do those type of sessions than just come back and barely sweat on a 1 hour ride. And it's going to work for a certain period of time. And that's probably as well one of the other factors that I was talking about, is that it's going to work until it doesn't. Meaning, when you don't have an engine, then pushing yourself to the limit every day is fine, because you can't hurt yourself. But once you've got, I always use the 2CV kind of analogy. When you have a 2CV engine and a 2CV chassis, nothing bad can happen. You can press as hard as you want on the accelerator. You're not going to break anything. But after 3, 4, 5 years of doing CrossFit at high intensity, you've built muscle mass, you've built capacity, you've built the high end. You have a V8 turbo inside the chassis of a 2CV car. And now when you press on the accelerator, you're going to just fold in half, or you're going to go straight into the wall, because you just don't have the structure to support that kind of power. And this is what you see, and this is probably my bias, because those are the people that come and see me, but the archetype of the CrossFitter that starts getting interested in Zone 2 is they started CrossFit a few years back. They went hard. It brought results. When they started to plateau, they did more and they did harder, and that brought more results. But they got to a point where doing more and doing harder actually started to break them down and didn't enable them to go to the next level. So the analogy I use is that of gears. They're stuck in third gear and they're trying to push on the accelerator as hard as they can, but they're revving up in the red zone, and trying to push the accelerator when you're there is not going to make you go faster. You need to push the clutch, you need to shift gears, get into fourth, your RPMs are going to come down, and then you can build back up into fourth and above. And it's that shifting gears that is really hard, because they had that pattern of, it doesn't work, or I'm not progressing anymore, so I'm going to do more and I'm going to do harder. Okay, that works. And then I do it again. Okay, that works. So I'm going to do it again, but now it doesn't work. And now it goes the other way. And this is when you have to change focus. And those people usually, come to me either injured or overtrained or unable to tolerate the weekly volume that they're trying to impose to themselves. Because again, when you train hard 3 days a week, you can probably do that for a while without any, significant issues. But those people are starting to train twice a day, 5, 6, 7 days a week. And none of those sessions are easy. They're all super hard. They're doing the strength, they're doing the weightlifting, they're doing the gymnastics, they're doing CrossFit tests and workouts. And this is usually when the car starts breaking down. And so the focus on, there's that other thing that seemed too easy before, but now it sounds kind of good because I'm all broken down. I can't even fucking function on a Friday because I'm already toast from my week of training. So maybe I'll try that. And magically, it seems to work because your nervous system is going to thank you for it. You're going to rebalance things out. And then all the adaptations that we know that are going to come from it are going to come and support all that top end that you've already built and just allow you to move to that fourth gear, allow you to move to that next level. So there's that cultural shifts, or I guess that natural progression of people wanting to do more, do harder until it doesn't work and they start breaking down, and now they have to shift gears. There's also just a general tendency of the last, I would say maybe 15, 20 years of all the high intensity research that has come out showing that you can do, Wingate protocols and spend 40 times less time training and get the same adaptations because 6 weeks of Wingates 3 times a week gives you the same aerobic adaptations as long and steady, but you spend so much less time training. And so people use those studies to justify, okay, no, I'm just going to do the high intensity stuff because it works and because it's the same as the easy stuff. And my counter argument to that is usually that's a 6-week study, usually on untrained people or moderately trained people. And once you get to a trained level, how many weeks of Wingate protocols can you do 3 times a week, 4 times 30 seconds all out with 4-minute rest in between? How many times can you do that until you literally go into a burnout? And the answer is not that many when you're at a high level. So those studies work well in isolation. And again, I am not anti-intensity. Intensity is very important for health and for performance, but you have to dose it right. And it's a dosage question. It's about, okay, how much Wingate can you tolerate per week? The higher level you are, the less you can do because the bigger engine you have. And the natural parallel to that is how much low intensity volume can you tolerate per week? And the answer for everybody is a lot more than you think. And you're not nearly doing enough at this point in time. So there's that aspect of, I guess, the general culture of exercise that is also shifting. But if you look back to, training manuals from 40 years ago and coaches back then, it's nothing new. It's not like Zone 2 didn't exist before. Every endurance athlete at any high level has been doing massive amounts of low intensity training. And that was true 40 years ago. And that was also true 20 years ago for the best. And now it might just be coming back on the front of the scene because of those different factors that I mentioned. So I'd say it's multifactorial. And it's very much a cultural shift, which I think is a good thing because now we're getting back to a balance. And obviously it's a pendulum, right? The trends are just pendulums and they go and they come. And it's probably going to shift too far in the other direction. And people are going to say, okay, I'm just going to do only that. And then they're going to feel flat and not going to have any more top end. And they say, oh, fuck, I got to go back to high intensity now. And the cycle continues. So it's just about finding that happy medium between the two, or knowing when to swing the pendulum a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, depending on who you are, what's your background, what time of the season is it, what are your needs for competition, when is your next competition, et cetera, which is, I guess, our job as coaches.
Yeah, I definitely think I started to see that in the social media space, where people were kind of changed everything. We're doing probably a little bit too much zone or low intensity work to the point that we're starting to lose a little bit on the top end. So like you said, everything swings and roundabouts. Something gets really popular, people apply it inappropriately, do too much of it and kind of miss the point of what they're doing, which is a shame, because then all of a sudden social media starts to come after it. and you start getting the memes saying, "Oh, this is rubbish," or "This is." People are not understanding it, and people utilize that as clout to try and drive attention to their accounts. So, and also, definitely recognize the papers which you were talking about regarding, like Wingate's 3 times a week, and if we did this high intensity training, we can get the same adaptations in a shorter amount of time. There does seem to be a real, not push for it, but there's a common theme where studies are trying to find something that's more time efficient, that can get the same adaptations in less time, but they don't necessarily always think about, well, what does that mean long term? And they might have like a paragraph towards the end of the discussion where they talk about the implications of this long term, but it's not in the discussion, the conclusion, usually not in the abstract, and that's where people look most. So they look in these areas for the definitive conclusions as, this, doing high intensity more often, you're going to get the same adaptations in less time. That's what you should be doing. And then missing the more deeper discussion in the actual discussion, which is a bit of a shame. It's just, I guess people are looking for things which probably supports their original biases. And I'd say it's a poor utilization of research, which, I think is a real shame. But, we're all learning. And it's great to see both the coaching community and the scientific community develop in the same direction. I think it's doing better now. So,
agreed.
In terms of how this looks physiologically for a CrossFit athlete, say someone that's only been doing high intensity training for a long period of time, they've got that V8 engine, but they're stuck with the V2 Sashi, and they're trying to push into fourth gear and they can't. How does that look like physiologically? Do they have quite a large difference between where their first threshold is and their second threshold is? And ideally, we kind of want to develop that base so that we're moving our first threshold a bit closer to where the second threshold is. So we've got like a larger, you can do zone low intensity at a higher intensity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to describe it. And that's exactly what I see in CrossFitters that I test is the 2 thresholds are very far apart. And the first threshold is at a very low absolute and relative intensity for that person, and especially given their level. And so what, physiologically what that looks like is, high blood lactate levels at virtually very low intensities. And what that means is just from a metabolic standpoint, from a nervous standpoint, that has a cost. It's more costly to do even that easy-ish work for them than it would be if they did have a higher first threshold, more endurance, more low intensity capacity. So I would probably put it as, a way to frame it, and it's an image, and it's probably not exactly what happens, but it's almost like an atrophy of type 1 fibers, where they're never actually fatigued, they're never solicited in isolation, so they didn't get a chance to develop. And a good way to frame the energetic side of things, I think, is to oppose or to combine the glycolytic and the oxidative pathways, in the sense that you're going to have, muscle cells, enzymes that are going to produce lactate via glycolysis, and then you're going to have mainly your mitochondria that are heavily present in type 1 fibers, not only, but mainly in type 1 fibers, or especially in type 1 fibers, that are going to use oxygen and they're going to be able to recycle that lactate. And you need a balance of both. You need to be able to use glycolysis as a pathway, and it's going to allow you to generate high amounts of ATP in short amounts of time. But if you don't have the recycling capacity on the back end to deal with it, now you're running into a wall pretty quickly, because those accumulating levels, although we know lactate is not the cause of fatigue, it comes together with other factors that are going to fatigue and not allow you to continue your contractions either at the rate or for the time that you would like. And the analogy for that is probably the recycling station for a town. If you have a big city, you want a really robust infrastructure in terms of recycling. You want all the trucks, you want all the workers, you want the centers that are going to be able to collect all that garbage and deal with it. And if you don't have that infrastructure in place, now your big city is not going to run very well because it can't cope with the amount of shit that it's producing, essentially. And I'm not saying that lactate is shit. It's not. It's a byproduct of metabolism. It's a half sugar, and your body can reuse it. But again, it usually starts accumulating together with other factors that are going to cause muscle contractions not to happen well anymore. So long story short, if we can have more trash recycling facilities in our bodies, which are the mitochondria and capillaries that are kind of the trucks that bring the stuff to the mitochondria, then we can better deal with that, and we can, have a city that grows bigger and that is more active and as such produces more stuff without exceeding the recycling capacity of that city. I'm still working on that city recycling analogy, but I think it's coming along.
I think it works really well, and moves nicely into my next question. Because say I'm a sanctional CrossFit athlete, and I want to reach the games, I may suspect I may have some kind of not deficiency, but my aerobic conditioning may not be where it needs to be to operate at the elite of the elite. Mm-hmm. So how could I potentially test? Say I came to you, what would you do with me to try and determine if I could use more low intensity training? And then what type of changes do you think you might give to my training program? I mean, obviously that's a very broad question because what is my training program? But would you just try and increase the amount of low intensity work I was doing, or would you have to think about where that was in terms of the competition calendar? Because I guess if you did that very near, I don't know, the open or any time that I needed to be peaking, would it have the effect that you would want?
So I'm going to start by, making it so all the listeners don't want to listen to me anymore. And I'll say that most people should start by cutting 30 to 50% of their training volume because they can't actually assimilate that volume. And an easy way to figure that out is, again, if you're getting to Friday and you want that week to be over so bad because you're so tired and you just can't recover, this is a sign that you're doing too much relative to your capacity, your work capacity, essentially. So that's a good first diagnosis. And once you've done that, again, you want to reduce your training volume and or intensity, depending again on the time of year. And obviously, when you're closer to competitions, you want more of that high intensity because that's what you're going to be expressing in your tests and your competition. And if you're farther away from those kind of season highs, you can allow yourself to have less intensity and also to have less elements in your training that directly reflect the sport that you're competing in. I think the higher level you get, the more your off-season should look nothing like your in-season training. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb. At the beginning, you can do CrossFit year-round. You're not going to hurt yourself. You're going to get better. You're going to keep improving. You need to practice the skills anyway. So just go for it. But as soon as you start moving up into the ranks, you need to start to think, okay, now I'm competing, now I'm training, now I'm competing, now I'm training. And the development phase is not the same as the competition phase. And we go back to, really old concepts of periodization where you have a general phase, a specific phase, a competition phase, and a transition phase. And if you can understand those 4 phases and integrate them in your training year, you'll already be miles above the rest because, and again, culturally in CrossFit, this is not part of the conversation. And the main reason for that, I'll go on a little tangent there and then come back to your initial question. I think the main reason for that is because, and we probably talked about that in the first podcast, is that CrossFit started as a GPP methodology and philosophy, where you would do CrossFit in the gym and then you would go express your fitness in a sport outside somewhere else. So you would use CrossFit in addition to any sport that you were doing. The day the CrossFit became a sport for some, we forgot that GPP part of training, because now CrossFit is your sport. So it went to the specific box. It was in the general box. Now it's in the specific box. What did you do to fill up that general box again? Usually nothing. So you just started doing CrossFit year round, and that was the only thing that you did. So now all you're doing is your sport, day in and day out. It's like a soccer player doing 5 games of soccer per week to get ready for the Saturday game. It's like a marathon runner doing 3 marathons a week because he's got a marathon to get ready for on the Saturday. It doesn't work like that. You can't train and test the same, or at least not forever. So you have to have that differentiation between development phases, general phases, and then specific phases and competition phases. And going back to your initial question on how we would assess that. So I put athletes through physiological testing. So we'll do essentially a step test. And you do 4 minutes of work, 1 minute of rest, 4 minutes of work, 1 minute of rest. Between each stage, we go up, and the steps might be 15 to 25 watts, depending on your level, where you start at, what your performance level is, whether you're male or female, and your general characteristics. So essentially, I tailor the steps and where we start and by how much we go up to the level of that person in order to get about 10 steps out of them. So they go all the way until they can't hold the power anymore. And those 10 steps give me a good view of the intensity spectrum, usually starting at 1 out of 10 and finishing at 10 out of 10. That's kind of how it goes. So you could even, without any tools or anything, run that just based on RPE, and just, maybe measure your heart rate and then write down your RPE for legs, heart, and breathing. So you have 3 RPEs. That's something we can come back to later, because I do think it's a tool that is accessible to anybody, that is free, and that is heavily underappreciated. And I'm lucky enough to have all those measurement tools. So we're going to measure lactate. We're going to measure muscle oximetry with the Moxie. We're going to measure ventilation and VO2 with the VO2 Master, and heart rate, of course. And based on that, I can determine where things start to change internally. And that's going to inform me, where's your low intensity? Where's your high intensity? What about in the middle? And, you said it was a broad question, but I have a broad answer for you based on all the testing that I've done. And that's for the vast majority of sports. If we take out long events, if we take out, 1 hour plus events, or even 2 hour plus events. So not talking about, marathons, not talking about Ironman, triathlon. If we focus on, CrossFit, combat sports, team sports, any high intensity activity, you've been training at high intensity for virtually your whole sporting career. And the best thing you can do is add some low intensity. So usually I'll say for somebody who doesn't do any, going back to my initial point, cut your volume by 30 to 50%, depending on how you feel at the end of your training week. And then add in ideally a couple hours of low intensity per week. And you don't need all those measurements. You can literally just go easy twice a week for an hour. If you don't have an hour twice a week, you can do 4 times 30 minutes. Yes, longer is better, but if you do 0 right now, doing even 3 times 20 minutes is going to be better than doing 0. So progressive overload applies to this just like it does to everything else. Start little and then build it up. But for competitors, if you're not doing 2 hours a week of easy stuff, but you're training 12 hours a week, there's a problem in your intensity distribution. So you have to rectify that. And in addition to that low intensity, once every 2 weeks, even if you want to start easy, add a tempo-like session, which would be, start with maybe 2 times 10 minutes at an RPE of 6. 10 minutes, you're probably going to have 4-to-1 work to rest ratio. So out of 10 minutes, you do maybe 2-3 minutes of active recovery. And like I said, it's easy work. It's 6 out of 10. So your legs are burning a little bit, but nothing else is really hard. You can still hold a conversation. You can't read poetry, but you can talk to someone with, medium sentences. Your heart's not, beating out of your chest. Your breathing's under control. Your legs, like I said, are a little bit heavy. And this type of work that literally nobody does, one, because it's really hard when you get to, a 3 by 20 minutes at 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, it's really hard. You want to stop. And it's half physical, half mental, because your legs are burning, but it's not that hard. You know you can go much harder than that, and you'd rather go harder and make it stop sooner. But if you stick to the plan, you stick to that 6 or 7 out of 10. So your legs are on fire. Your brain is just sending you signals like crazy to say stop, 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 because it hurts and it's uncomfortable and it's so long and it's boring at the same time. Oh my God, what's going on? But I found that the combination of that low and say medium intensity is the best thing that anybody or any athlete can do for their GPP and for their general conditioning. And this general conditioning, usually done on a bike, because zero impact, because zero skill, will have a massive transfer to the rest of your activities. It's literally the base of the pyramid that you've never worked on. And if you raise the bottom of the pyramids, it's like the rising tide rises all boats. The boat is the high intensity, and the low and medium intensity is the tide. You're going to bring everything higher. You're going to be able to recover faster. You're going to be able to do more work. You're going to be able to, like I said, recover faster between reps, between sets, between training sessions, between training weeks. It's fractal in that way. And at the beginning, it really surprised me when CrossFitters came to me after doing this type of training and said, "Oh, you know what? I feel like I recover faster during transition in my workout." So they're doing a test, doing a WOD, and they go from the rower to handstand push-ups, and within that 5-10 seconds, they can feel the difference in recovery. So it really applies to all levels of recovery. And this is what is great about general. It doesn't have to look like your sport. It doesn't have to feel like your sport, because we're developing general qualities that will serve the sport and the specifics that you're training for.
It's always great to hear a simple, very actionable answer. Like, I think people would think of my question and think there'll be very specific things that they need to make changes. But, you said, well, it's a broad question, but here's a broad answer. Like, so many different people of different levels could apply what you've just said and see such an amazing improvement in their performance and ability to recover. So I think, that's really, really great to hear. Regarding, obviously, my original one looked at me as maybe a sanctional athlete and the difference between like sub-elite to elite. But say we've got a youth athlete who has aspirations of making the games. And you described how at the beginning, when you're a novice, you can kind of just train CrossFit for a considerable amount of time and still see improvements, which I guess a youth athlete would be a novice because they're getting into the sport. Would you say maybe they need to start incorporating that GPP early on to really develop that aerobic conditioning to help provide the ability to recover from the high intensity stuff, the skill work that they might do? Because get that high tide early. So that means you can really sort of peak once you reach the right age for reaching the CrossFit Games.
The topic of young youth athletes is always a tricky one, but I'll happily go on the limb and say that obviously if you want to win the games at 16, then you just have to do CrossFit, and that's just how it is. If you want to be the best CrossFitter in 10 years, I would argue that at 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, your training should look nothing like CrossFit. Because the broader the base, the higher the pyramid. And we know that athletes that peak early in life, there won't be anybody left in 5 years later. So it really depends on when you want to win. And I'm not a huge fan of all the youth categories that are already in place. And unfortunately, we've seen in the past couple years with Haley Adams, with Mal O'Brien, young athletes that have been in the sport for many years just not be able to take the pressure anymore. And obviously it's a combination of things: the sport itself, the media, the expectations with the levels that these girls were at, which was phenomenal, by the way. But we don't want that. We want athletes that are good now and that are good in 10 years. Matt Fraser, he was at the top for 5 years. He probably could have pushed it for a few more years. And his training looked nothing like CrossFit when he was younger. He was a weightlifter. And you see other people at the highest level that were, high level swimmers. And And I do think that specializing too early is a bad idea, period. And obviously there's caveats and we can go into details, but as a broad stroke comment on the youth development in sports, the later you peak in your sport, the better. Obviously, relative to what is genetically possible. If you want to be a high-level gymnast as a woman, as a female, you kind of have to be there early because we know you're probably not going to get there when you're 30. And the opposite is true for long endurance sports, where we know that the higher performances are going to be reached later in life, simply because it takes 10 years to accumulate the volumes that allow you to be the best at those kind of sports. So for a young CrossFitter who wants to go to the games, again, it depends if they want to go to the games next year or in 10 years and how long they want to last in the sport. But I would argue, build the broadest athletic base that you can. Train like a triathlete, train like a weightlifter, train like a gymnast, try to fill the gaps in between, learn some combat sports, do many different things that are going to give you the broadest athletic base. Obviously, sprinkle some CrossFit in there because you need the specific movements. It's a sport now, and we know what's the unknown and unknowable is funny because we exactly know what movements are going to be there, unless we throw in some crossover, double unders at some point, which throw people for a loop. But 95% of movements we know in advance. We know what you're going to we have to be good at. And so can you build quality volume over time in those patterns without necessarily intensifying right away, or at least not all the time? So I would take a much longer outlook on performance. I think like we should do for kids. 12-year-olds are not meant to be competing against each other and themselves every single day of the week. It's mentally draining. It's physically draining. We want kids that are going to live a long, healthy life. And often if we push them too early, the performance is going to come at the expense of their health and longevity, and also sometimes mental sanity in the long run. So we have to consider all those elements when we're talking about developing youth athletes.
Now, it's really interesting to hear your take on it, because I know it's very popular and very highly recommended in other sports to do multi-sports for a long time, up until like you're 16, and then you start to specialize once you reach 17, 18. And the best athletes are the ones that peak later because they didn't specialize so early. Yet when it comes to CrossFit, it almost feels like CrossFit's the general training anyway. So I'm already doing it, but technically, no, you're doing the specific stuff if you're just doing CrossFit early on.
Yeah.
And
it's if that's all you're doing, it's not general, it's your sport.
Yeah. And especially with what was happening now, because I know there's been some conversations around, well, you got Matt Fraser, who was a weightlifter. You've got, I think, Tia Claire Toomey was a track athlete. So they've got loads of history in a different sport before they transitioned to CrossFit. But now you've got these youth athletes that have only done CrossFit. So surely they're going to be even better because they've just spent more time doing it. And I just don't think that's going to be the case. And obviously we've seen it with Mal O'Brien and Haley Adams. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of different factors there. So to pin it on that is a bit short-sighted. But, I think there is, like you said, the dangers of focusing on just CrossFit too early are going to start showing their head in the next few years, possibly. And we might start reframing what youth athletes do now. So, yeah, it was great to hear your opinion on that, because people's perception, I think, are a little bit different as to what should happen. And maybe we need to link it back to actually what's been encouraged, especially in the last decade in other sports.
Mm-hmm.
I want to link it to sort of finish up the podcast to talk a bit more about your work in respiratory training. I listened to your podcast with Louisa Sonnegaard. Sorry if I pronounced the surname wrong there, but I thought that was really, right, yeah. I thought that was a really fascinating one. I know she's been working with you with the Breathe Way Better, and I just thought, I know that you're developing a course in this area of respiratory training. So clearly, you were seeing either a gap in what people's knowledge are, or you're definitely seeing like, actually, I'm starting to see the benefits of this type of training, but it's not really done that much. So maybe I need to start developing a course to help people learn that, which is great. Was it a similar thing as to, when it came to going more into the aerobic conditioning, you started to really focus like your courses, your podcast there, and then you were starting to say, actually, there's a gap here with breathing. Maybe I'll go into learning a bit more of that. Was it kind of a similar process as to why you've gone down the route of respiratory training?
Yeah, 100%. So it started again with Evan. I have to, give credit where credit's due. So Evan, my friend, thank you so much for what you've brought to me and my life in general, in and outside of work. Together with this new understanding of bioenergetics that I got through Evan and then others, there was the topic of respiratory training that was floating in that ecosystem. And going back maybe before Evan, I think where it originally came from is a guy called Jörg Feldman. Jörg Feldman, who was a pioneer in endurance training, in physiological testing as well, and in respiratory training. And his work dates back to, I think, more than 20 years now. And back then he was already, testing people, and originally it was with lactate, and then they started using Moxie, and they all did respiratory training. And there was this period in time more than 10 years ago where I believe the Swiss national mountain bike team was, head and shoulders above the rest, and they all attributed it to respiratory training. And that's something that's pretty niche still today, and that's not spoken about a lot. And I, again, got exposed to it through Evan, I never had the chance to talk with Jörg, but I have a good connection with Andrew, his son. And so we spoke about it. And in this whole ecosystem, there was, Brian Kozak from Evolve Performance down in Texas. He's been working on this with Jörg since the beginning. And I've learned so much through these guys, Aaron Davis, and more. Daniel Krambach has been a big influence on everything that I do and know today as well. And from those people's perspective, it was an evidence that it had to be part of, the conversation. Your respiratory muscles, your diaphragm, your intercostals, your abs, they're muscles like any other muscle. And we train other muscles in the gym. Why don't we train those muscles as well? And I think the main element to understand when it comes to the importance or the place that respiratory training can take and its impact on performance, first and foremost, it's well documented that respiratory training has positive effects on performance, especially in endurance sports. It's been well documented in cycling, in rowing, in running, and other sports as well, in swimming. And I think one of the main things to understand is that your brain's main focus is to survive, no matter what. It just wants to keep you alive and pass down the genetic material to the next to the next generation, to keep things very, very easy and 3,000 feet kind of perspective. And when we talk about fatigue, if we're doing a constant effort, so conditioning type workout or effort, the thing that's interesting is that your brain's going to decide where the blood flow goes. And to decide where it goes, it has a hierarchy, because it can't just give blood everywhere all the time. Otherwise, you run out of blood pressure and you just faint. And the brain can't allow it for that. So it's going to prioritize. Again, it's going to say no to certain things to say yes to other things. So the brain's going to say yes to itself, because it has to run. So the brain is top of the food chain. Then we have the internal organs that have to function, otherwise bye-bye. Then after that, it's not your legs that power your bike effort right now that are priority after that, because what's more important than that is your diaphragm. If your diaphragm fatigues and you don't breathe, you die. And your brain knows that. So if your respiratory muscles fatigue during an effort, and that's, again, the phenomena is called respiratory metaboreflex. And that is, again, well documented. Jerome Dempsey has done a lot of work on that, and others as well. And essentially, when your diaphragm fatigues, your brain is going to sense that, and it's going to then constrict the vessels in the rest of your body, your legs, for example, that are working hard and that need oxygen, that need blood, but they're not going to get as much because the diaphragm is screaming and needs help. So we're going to bring the blood flow over there. And that actually reduces performance directly. And they've actually done the opposite as well, which is a really nice study that they did where they put someone, and I think Jerome Dempsey did it himself. He's considered to be the kind of the grandfather of respiratory physiology. And I had him on the podcast a couple of years ago. Phenomenal guy. And I believe it was him. He was on a bike and he had a mechanical respirator. So there was a machine that was assisting his ventilation mechanically in a way that unloaded the respiratory muscles. So they couldn't really fatigue in that situation. And when they did the with ventilator and without ventilator, what they saw is that the blood flow to the legs changed, and the time to task failure changed, and the effort perception changed as well. So essentially, by unloading your respiratory muscles, you have more blood going to the legs, you can do more work, and you can, and that work feels easier to you. So by training the respiratory system and by making it stronger, by making it more endurant, and delaying that respiratory fatigue, we can actually improve our performance directly. I think this is, if there was one argument for respiratory training, it has to be that, is simply that hierarchy of where the blood goes when things get tired. And then based on that, I started to dig into this whole world of respiratory training, which again is well documented, but it's also very narrowly studied. And what I mean by that is what you find in most studies. They use a resistance device, like a power breathe, for example, and they're going to do 30 reps twice a day, 5 days a week for, say, 4 to 8 weeks. And that's kind of the standard protocol. And I believe that was initially empirically devised, and they've done some manipulations of, higher resistance, less reps, and then the opposite, and see what yields best results. So that's kind of the consensus that they came to. But that's what most studies are based on. This is, 95% of respiratory training research is made with that device and with that protocol. But we don't take into account that there's a breatheway, there's other devices that are different, that work on, the volume aspect, the coordination aspect. There's likely many different protocols that we could employ that haven't even been touched. There's the whole aspect of how do you control your breathing? Can you lie down on the ground and differentiate between abdominal, diaphragmatic, and thoracic breathing? Can you tolerate CO2 at high levels or not? And then this whole kind of world opens up once you start looking left and right. And the issue is that it's so little has been done in the holistic perspective of respiratory training that you have people emerge of, I'm in the Brian McKenzie camp, or I'm in the Wim Hof camp, or I'm in the Oxygen Advantage camp, no, I'm in the Power Breathe camp, I'm in the Breatheway camp. And all those camps all sit under the umbrella of respiratory training, but we don't know how to organize them together. They're all parts of a cohesive whole. And this is what I'm trying to do with this course, is to obviously bring a theoretical foundation to it. So we talk about the anatomy of the respiratory system and all its moving parts. We talk about the functions of the respiratory system and how all these things interact, how ventilation works, how gas exchange works, how the respiratory system interacts with the other systems in the body, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, how breathing influences, heart rate and the nervous system. And then what are the limitations of the respiratory system? We talked about the respiratory metaboreflex. There's some other kind of peculiar limitations that can arise in some populations. Arterial hypoxemia, where your arterial blood starts to desaturate at high intensities. That only affects a small proportion of athletes. How does altitude limit your performance? What happens at altitude? Why does it change your performance? What happens when you dive underwater? Because again, it's the respiratory system thing, and how the gases go from the outside to the inside. What different ways do we have to evaluate the respiratory system? We talked about thresholds. So you have ventilatory thresholds, you have spirometry, you have pulmonary function test, which is kind of the equivalent. You have muscle function or the function of your muscle, of your respiratory muscles. So talking about maximum inspiratory and expiratory pressure. You have CO2 tolerance tests. You have coordination tests. You have all those different elements. And then you obviously have the biggest part, which I kind of get to at the end, which is training, and all those different training modalities that are available, different devices, different protocols, different philosophies with different goals, each one of them. And then how can we essentially give a foundation to people that are interested in that so that they understand the underlying physiology and then get a sense as to where it could be taken? Because again, it has been studied, but 30 reps twice a day, 5 days a week. That's essentially the protocol that's been tested. What happens when you build in the breathe way better? What happens when you build in CO2 tolerance? What happens when you teach someone just how to manipulate their breathing and dissociate between different structures that they can move and control independently? So that's what I've been working on for the last couple months, and I'll be finishing at the end of this month here in July, is trying to bring a global perspective on the respiratory system and respiratory training in particular. And again, keeping in mind that this is my perspective. I don't have all the information, and there's other people out there that are very competent in that area as well. And people should aim to look at those different perspectives, but try to gain a holistic understanding of the question to then figure out how we can apply it. And my hope with this course is that more people will dive into respiratory training and start applying it critically to their training with different athletes, with using different protocols, different tools, and come back with some valuable information on, okay, this works really well for that population. This doesn't really work for that application, because we need a more global understanding, and currently it's not there.
That sounds absolutely incredible and incredibly detailed. No wonder it's taken you several months to create it. I'm looking.
It's been more than a year in the making. I released my first digital course in March last year, and I knew that the respiratory course had to be the next thing, and the next thing got pushed back and pushed back and pushed back because many other things came in between. And I also, at some point, accepted the fact that the longer I push it, the more information I'll have on it and the better it'll be. So I've left myself take enough time before I put it out. And yeah, no, I haven't rushed it. And now's the time. So I've been kind of full gas on this course for the last, I'd say, couple months now. And I've got 3 more weeks of work to do on it. First 4 modules are done, so now is the biggest one, the training one, with, like I said, all the different tools that exist. And I had most of them, but then I also bought all the ones that I didn't have. So I'm going to be testing all the tools and explaining how they work and what is this one good for, what is that one good for, what are the main differences, upsides, downsides. Because I would like this field to be more developed, but I just can't do it by myself. So I kind of want to pass the baton to the next person, to the next coach, athlete that wants to take that further and then experiment and then see where we can take it. Because I definitely think it has to be part of the conversation for anybody who's serious about training and trains, anywhere 10 hours a week or upwards, and that is competitive and dedicates their, a large part of their time and their life to this. It is an untapped aspect for most people. And what I've also seen, and going back to our prior conversation of, testing CrossFit athletes and athletes in general, the heart is rarely the limiting factor for those high intensity sports, because they've done enough high intensity, their pump is working just fine. And what usually comes out is it the legs limiting you, meaning your metabolism and your low intensity, medium intensity capacity, or is it the respiratory system limiting you? And some people are more prone to respiratory limitations than others. We know that female have 20 to 30% smaller respiratory systems, all things, equated. If we even, I think, if you normalize even for, height, weight, and hemoglobin mass, women still have a smaller, quote unquote, respiratory system. So, and according to Jerome Dempsey, they're more prone to respiratory limitations. And that's something that I do see in my testing. And now it's almost an evidence where when people come out of testing and their respiratory RPE is higher than the rest, because I ask all 3, right? Legs, heart, and respiratory at each stage of the test. If they finish the test and they say they were hyperventilating, they couldn't control their breathing, they say my RPE, breathing is a 10, but my legs are at an 8 and my heart is at a 7. Well, that tells me right then and there what they have to work on in order to get that limiter out of the way and then get on to the next one. And like I said, the heart is virtually never the limiter for those high intensity sports because they've done it enough. It's going to be the legs and the breathing and a certain balance of the two. And also for anybody who's interested in just furthering their athletic development, developing the understanding and control they have on their own body, breathing is one of the most phenomenal things because it's the only way that we have to directly impact our nervous system, right? So I'm going to talk about all the training side of things. And there's this whole spectrum of, meditation, self-reflection, calming down, that is phenomenally impacted by breathing, and that's why breathing is a central part of most of the cultures and philosophies in the world. And for those interested in that, go read Breath by James Nestor. It's a fantastic book on the topic that really explores this cultural side of breathing and all the different aspects of it. You can overstimulate or stimulate your parasympathetic branch and calm down. You can also activate your sympathetic nervous system with certain types of manipulation of breathings. So yeah, it's a whole world that has barely been touched, and we need more people working in there.
When's the course out? If it finishes, you finish making it in July. Is it out in August?
It's coming out July 27th in French.
Okay.
And then I have to translate it into English, which is my job for August. So my hope, I don't have a release date in English yet, but my hope and my goal is to have the English version done by the end of August, which honestly should be more than doable because all the slides are done. I just have to translate them. And if you've seen my stuff, there's not too much text on my slides. So it's really translate the titles, translate what I'm going to say, and then re-record. The big piece of the work, which, like I said, is coming up for me in the next 3 weeks, is all the exercises, which I'm going to film, and I'm probably going to voice over them so that I can voice over in English for the English version, and have everything duplicated in a second language, which it's the goal for August. And I mean, since I'm saying it here on air, I don't have a choice now. So end of August, you can expect the English version of the respiratory course in English.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm using this podcast as a bit of like an accountability thing for you, so you can.
I love it. I hate you for it, but I love you too.
Just to finish up, because I know I wanted to touch on your use of the RPE, where you have an RPE for both heart, legs, and lungs. And you were saying how rarely it's the heart, it's usually the lungs and legs, let's say, or muscular. Is this, you normally determine this via a step test? And do you do the step test on different modalities, different ergs? Because of the position of the diaphragm, can that also have an effect on how limited the respiratory system is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've done most of my testing so far. So I've explored different modalities for a particular athlete. So, and the protocol that I use, I've used it on a bike a lot, in running a lot, rowing, skiing, cross country, arm crank or winch or grinder, whatever you want to call that. I've done it on a kayak erg. I've done it on enough different modalities to know that it can be transferred, but most of my testing is done on the bike because there's zero technique and because it's a very good way to condition the body and get ready for any other physical activity or sport that you're into. So this is why I've been kind of centered on the bike. But yes, like you said, on a rower, every stroke you have to stabilize your spine to produce power, and your diaphragm has a double role of being your main inspiratory muscle, and it's also your main spinal stabilizer together with your whole core. So this does play a role, and you have to entrain your breathing to the rowing stroke. You can't you can't breathe out of sync with your rowing. So this is a kind of a particular aspect of rowing where you have to entrain it. It works better when you run and you entrain your breathing to the running up to a certain point. Obviously at high intensities, it's harder to do. But going back to your initial question, yes, you would probably see, and I haven't done enough tests. I don't have a big enough data sample to answer your question, but in theory, I would say that yes, depending on the modality, even thinking of a triathlete that would spend most of his time on a long course in a TT position, we know that this impairs breathing, and that's why you see triathletes like Jameson Plews, who won St. George last year as a U24 and is coming up on the senior scene now, who works with Luke Way, the inventor of the Breathe Way Better. and who works on his respiratory training in TT position. And that's, again, another aspect of respiratory training that I didn't even touch on, is integrating the respiratory training into the modality itself, into the training itself, without making it a separate part of training. And so, yes, depending on the position that you're going to assume and you're testing, the respiratory system could be more of a limiting factor simply because of the position that you're in. But in general, like I said, I test on the bike, and people don't usually assume a TT position unless they're training for that sport. So that's usually not a factor.
No, it's a question that's always been interested me, and it does really make sense. Like the athlete that was training in the TT position, doing his respiratory training in the TT position, because I'll think back to any type of training that I've done, and as soon as I do something overhead, so I don't know, say I'm training CrossFit and there's high reps overhead squats in the session, and I just feel like after 3 reps, my respiratory system just completely goes, and I have to break everything up completely, just because my legs feel fine. I feel like I'm fine, but I just can't breathe properly. And I guess when you talk about stabilizing the spine, like, you're really trying to stabilize the whole body and the spine when you're holding something overhead, especially something like a barbell. So that position could be quite difficult for the respiratory system to work. So I guess that's where my initial question came from. I guess it's a reflection of training that I've done. And then, it kind of makes sense, the TT athlete.
100%. Overhead is very hard for most people, and obviously mobility and general control of your structures plays a role. That's one of the things we explore in the program with the Breatheway is once you've gotten through the fundamentals of using the device and being able to do it sitting on a chair in an easy position, let's say, then you go, at a bottom of a squat and you try to breathe there and see how much volume you can move in that position. And then you put your arms overhead. How much can you move there? And like you said, one of the tricky parts of overhead is depending on your shoulder mobility. If you don't have the prerequisites there to be in a perfectly neutral, quote unquote, I use the quotation marks because neutral is always a big word to use, neutral thoracic position, then what's going to happen? You're going to be in a slightly hyperextended position, which means that more of the load is going to have to go to your back and your diaphragm, because now your abs can't be in as stable a position when they're in their lengthened position compared to their mid-range, let's say. And if your abs aren't working, somebody's got to pick up the slack. The diaphragm is there. It's going to do the job. And if it's doing that at a high level, then it can't breathe. Or you just haven't trained yourself to manage moving volume in that position, which again can be worked on and should be worked on if that's a limiting factor in your performance and in your training. So yeah, we have to start to think of the respiratory system as an integral part of how our body functions. And when we talk about CrossFit, and you're gonna be going hard on all the WODs, if you can't move air efficiently and in a way that's not going to disrupt the whole functioning of your body, then there's probably some work to be done there, and some things to be gained, at the very least better understanding and control of how your body functions, and in the best cases some performance kickbacks. But it's always great to get the feedback from Luis and other athletes that go through the breathing program, because I don't even necessarily target the performance adaptations as a selling point. That's not the main goal. The main goal is learn to manipulate or learn to understand and control your breathing and your respiratory system in general. And then that's just the beginning. And then we can start to go into specifics and what we need to train and what we need to develop and which tool and what position. But first, do we all have a basic understanding of how to breathe? And for most people, that's a no. And for some people, for a lot of people, it's I don't know, because I've never tried and nobody has ever said anything to me. I read in a textbook that the breathing was not a limiting factor to performance, and that was the end of it. That's as far as they went. But I would encourage everybody to think twice and go down that path. And again, there's so many resources online. You can go on YouTube and find lots of breathing exercises, and they're all great because they're going to enlarge your spectrum and your control and your ability and your understanding of how this works. and then we can layer in training, and then we can layer in intensity, and then we can layer in complexity. But lie on the ground, put one hand on your belly, put one hand on your chest. Can you take a breath up top without moving the bottom? Can you take a breath at the bottom without moving the top? Can you breathe into your belly, hold your breath, and then pass that tension from your bottom hand to your top hand, and then release your breath, and vice versa? And if you already start with those little things, you're going to see that, there's a whole realm that I just don't control very well, and I can probably gain some insights and some valuable information by just going through those basic exercises.
I know you do a course, you are developing a course on respiratory training, but you also have a program on respiratory training. Where can people access that?
It's on my academy, upsidestrengthacademy.com, and go on the English version because it's both French and English. And in the programs, there's the introduction to respiratory training with Breathe Way Better. Again, I'm affiliated with Breathe Way Better. They're a company based out of British Columbia, Vancouver. Luke Way, Andrew Sellers, and Alex, the three guys that founded the company, and the great guys. I was lucky to meet Luke and Andrew at a training camp this year, and it's a very simple training device. And I essentially built a 10-week introductory program around this device, but not only in the sense that you have your Breathe Away training sessions every week, but you also have each week a different theme that we explore. So like I said, lie on the ground, put one hand on your belly, one hand on your chest, and try to differentiate the two, try to better control it. The following week, we go into, can you go into the end range of a stretch and then use the Breathe Way as a feedback mechanism and try to put air where you feel that it's tight. The following week, we might go into a warm-up, use the respiratory device in your warm-up before you go and do a 3-minute all-out effort, and see how you feel during that effort once your respiratory system is actually warmed up, because chances are your warm-up is inadequate and your respiratory warm-up is inexistent. So maybe we can, explore those different aspects over those 10 weeks. Luis finished the program. Like you said, we did a little feedback video, and always getting the feedback from the athletes and people that go through the program and how it impacted their training day to day. That's what's most interesting for me. And she's finished the 10 weeks. She's actually started back to week 1, because now with that new understanding, new perspective, new control, you're gonna go into the exercises differently, and you're gonna be able to, again, deepen and further that understanding. So it's very simple. It's nothing groundbreaking, I would say, but it's a little bit of structure where before there maybe was lacking.
Yeah, I definitely recommend everyone to check that out. It's such an underrated tool to be used. I think people just, because breathing's so habitual, they don't realize that it could be a limitation. So I think the course you're developing, this program, definitely anyone that's listening, really go check it out, especially all the other stuff on Upside Strength. So Sean, that was amazing as usual. Great catching up. I'm obviously going to give you a shout for round 3 at some point, because you've probably got another course coming by then, and I want to know all about it. So but it's great to speak to you, and how everything's been really developing nicely since obviously you made a transition with your work, and I can't wait to see how it all develops, and I'm going to definitely try and get hold of your course once it comes out in English.
It will come out in English at the end of August at the latest, thanks to you, Phil. And again, thanks so much for having me on. It's always great to catch up. So whenever you want to throw down again, I'm always game.
Brilliant. Sounds good to me.